In 2023, something peculiar was published, a companion novel to George Orwell's 1984, authorized by the Orwell estate. The title of the book is Julia, and the name of the author Sandra Newman. As the title suggests, it's a retelling of 1984 from the perspective of Julia instead of Winston Smith. Out of necessity, Newman has added elements which are not present in the original novel. Julia has been described as a woman's view on 1984 and even been labelled feminist. So, is Julia worth reading? I'll say right away that I had high expectations, and they were not met. To me, Julia is a disappointment. Essentially, there are 5 things that bother me. The first thing is that the subject matter of the first novel, totalitarianism, is treated superficially. Orwell's novel is a study in totalitarianism, whereas Newman's novel merely is a description. Put another way, Orwell's novel explores the soul of totalitarianism, whereas Newman's novel merely shows its face. In Julia, the psychological and political mechanisms behind the propaganda, 3-year plans, telescreens and thought police agents are seldom discussed. They're just there. This lack of depth makes the novel much less interesting to read than the original. The second thing is that it's less political than the original. Orwell was first and foremost a political writer, and said, I quote, "Every line of serious work I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it." In 1984, every single aspect of the story has a political purpose. For instance, when Winston Smith's everyday life is described, the main purpose isn't simply to flesh out the character, but to show how totalitarian systems work and how barren life is in totalitarian societies. Not so in Julia. It's not devoid of political musings which would be impossible in a companion novel to 1984, but it's more about human relations. If often feels like the society of Oceania merely is an exotic backdrop, that's not good enough if you write a companion novel to the arguably politically most important novel of all time. The third thing is that it's a less harrowing story, and thus a less potent warning against totalitarianism. The original novel shows with all the clarity one could wish for how totalitarianism oppresses, torments and crushes the individual. It instills a deep sense of dread and hopelessness in the reader, which no doubt is one of the novel's most powerful traits. Clearly, Orwell wanted to scare the reader, and he certainly succeeded. Julia is different in this respect. In Newman's novel, Ingsoc is not the all-powerful entity we meet in Orwell's novel. It's possible to cheat the system and, with the risk of revealing too much, escape it and even beat it. In fact, the tone is almost cheerful and humorous at times. Admittedly, it seems to have been like that in the USSR at times, but 1984 takes totalitarianism to its extreme to prove a point. The fourth thing is that the characters of the original novel basically are given fan fiction treatment. Not even secondary characters are spared. Newman has evidently asked herself questions like, I wonder how it was when Winston and Julia had sex. Do we really need to know that? The fan fiction treatment arguably makes the characters more human, but it also makes them more banal and unsympathetic. Julia comes through as depraved, and Winston as pathetic, quite far from how they are portrayed in the original novel. It's almost as if Newman wants to strip the iconic characters of the original novel of their dignity. The fifth thing is that it, in lack of a better word, is anachronistic. For instance, the Ministry of Plenty is a glass tower, there are sharpshooters in the helicopters, and there are remote-controlled surveillance drones. This is of course of lesser importance, but it's still a bit annoying. Orwell's novel is a vision of the future from the past, and since Newman's novel is so intimately interlinked with the original, it should follow suit. So, is Julia entirely without merit? No, not entirely. It has a couple of twists which prevent it from becoming predictable, and there are some dramatic events. At times, although not as often as one would wish, it manages to replicate the horrors of the ultra-totalitarian society in the original novel. Something I really found worth reading were the chapters about Julia's childhood and early youth. Newman describes how Ingsoc gradually tightened its grip on the UK and turned it into a living nightmare very convincingly. It's clearly inspired by the history of the USSR, but it's not derivative. So those are my thoughts on the novel Julia. If you agree or disagree or have something to add, let me know in the comments. See you in Dystopia.